So instead of it being a norm, it's something that's imposed and we're expected to take on as a norm. I describe it as the scaffolding which holds up heteronormativity. You must meet a man, you must get married, you must have children. And we're not ever when we don't see ourselves reflected in art, literature, music, TV, film, or radio soap operas. Now, some people would say, but you have Adam and Ian. I've got to be careful here because I know someone else is talking about Adam and Ian later. But Adam and Ian, there's two really interesting things about them. If I swapped either for a different gender, so made Adam a woman or Ian a woman, you could keep every single plot. They are homosexual, they are not gay. Going back to the Foucault quote. There is nothing about them that says that their identity as gay men is reflected in the show or matters to them. I wasn't sure what to put this in, but I'm going to ask me what it means afterwards if you don't know. It really worries me that I don't know between Adam and Ian which one tops and which one bottoms. I should know that if they were clear representations of gay men. So let's look at Shula. She's left a relationship rather than stay on the escalator. She's refused to stay with that should, with that heteronormativity that it's date, sex, engaged, marriage, die. She faced family rejection for being her authentic self. We've had it this week with Jim. Jim has basically said you should have stayed in an unhappy marriage. You should have not been authentic. And this is something LGBT/queer people often hear. Why are you shoving it down our throats? Why do you have to have a pride march? Why do you have to be yourself? Why can't you just stay hidden and unhappy and in the closet? When Shula left Alistair, she came out of a closet. She's rejected the conventional narrative for her gender. Jill, whoever's starting the I Hate Jill fan club, yeah. Jill directly told her that's what women do. Women put up with unhappiness. And Shula resisted that. She was like, no, I'm going to follow my heart. And her heart in this situation was, I'm going to leave Alistair. Then we have the concept of queer time. Queer time is a really interesting thing. Usually when most people in their teenage years, and someone's already mentioned Erickson, it's when you do identity formation. You start dating, you work out what you like, what you want to do, who you are. A lot of queer people in that period are like, ah! It gets delayed. So that doesn't really start till your 20s. Everything gets slower. Everything might be more flexible, more fluid. I sometimes describe queer time like getting the steps at Covent Garden tube station instead of going up in the lift. It's longer, it's slower, it takes you much more time to get to the top. Arlene Lev, who is one of the biggest researchers on transgender theory, she wrote the coming out model for trans people. And an awful lot of what she found was that trans people delayed coming out till their children had grown up because they didn't want to hurt their children by being their authentic self. So they remained closeted, often struggling with mental ill health, as we saw with Shula, for the sake of the children, and then would come out in their 40s, 50s and 60s. So, I am not saying that Shula is a trans-masculine demi-boy. I am saying she could be. But most of all, I'm saying, why do I have to write her as that? Why do I even have to think of her as that? Queering characters is a speculative fiction queer people create to see themselves. If we are not seeing ourselves in the Archers, then something has gone wrong. This is from the Queer Nation Manifesto. ACTA were an organisation in 1990 when AIDS was at its height, and the American government was basically refusing to fund any treatment, any research. They were leaving people to die. So Queer Nation, ACTA were very angry, and they produced this manifesto. Being queer means leading a different sort of life, It's not about the mainstream profit margins, patriotism or patriarchy, or being assimilated. It's not about executive directors, privilege and elitism. It's about being on the margins, defining ourselves. What is Shula doing but defining herself? There's my contact details. Big shout out to the big therapy group. Anyone else is a counsellor or psychotherapist? Join our group. Yes. I got the transmission dairy boy.
So it's time for just a couple of questions. Over here, and then we go back there. Catherine, is your mic working? Do you want to say it and we can just repeat the question from here?
It's more of a statement.
Yes. This is more of a comment.
It's a statement and a bit of a joke. I remember in when Donald Trump was campaigning to be elected, and he was decided that he would campaign for the LGBT vote. So he turns to the author queue and starts reading L, G, B, T, and quite clearly that man had never used those letters in that particular order in his life. So the only reason I'm less keen on queering is I want this to keep on adding more and more letters to make it harder and harder.
Can you imagine Brian saying all of those letters as well? Fantastic.
I think Brian is definitely someone who would talk about a queer. Yeah.
Can I take you back to this slide that you showed where you had the Adam and Ian on one side and Shula on the other? Yeah. But that's it. The last one, how does Shula reject the conventional narrative of her husband?
She should have.
It's a bit challenging question.
No. Just what Jill said. I mean, she should have stayed married. She should have put herself. Women sacrifice themselves. Sorry, I might sound like a feminist here. Women are meant to sacrifice themselves for the husband and the children. And Jill was, so you're unhappy, so what? That's what women do.
Last one.
How much do you think Shula and Kenton, having had the same upbringing, and remembering that for a long time Kenton was written as going to be gay, has that had an effect, do you think, on the way that we see Shula?
I didn't even have time to mention Charlie Thomas either. I think they got scared because he was such a central character, and then they rewrote him as Adam. That's my personal theory. But Kenton had the whole. We saw him from childhood. We saw the sort of queerness or the gayness, whatever you want to call it, woven in. And Adam just went, "Oh, I like men now."
No, right. Okay. That was brilliant.
We'll wrap that up on there. Thank you. I did chuckle at the mention there of Hampstead Heath, which is somewhere my dad used to go, and I think Adam would go to Hampstead Heath, definitely. So our next one, Engineers as Earth Mothers. This is an audio one. The story of why Alice can't be here will be said in a moment. So fingers crossed.
Engineers as Earth Mothers. Can fiction plough a furrow for female participation? My name is Fiona Gleed. I'm a PhD student at the University of Bath and one of just 7% of engineering professionals in the UK that are female. I can't be with you this weekend as I'll be watching my son perform at the Bristol Old Vic. At least I didn't put my daughter on the stage, but I do need to collect her from the airport to watch her brother. Drama has power. Here in Bristol, Show and Strength Theatre Company have taken to the stage to tell the story of Sarah Guppy. She holds patents related to the Clifton Suspension Bridge, but the name we all know is of the young man she mentored, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And on our radios, Alice Carter sneaks into homes across the country with her experiences as a female engineer. She is welcome here, but is hers a typical story? Alice grew up in rural Dorsetshire, the daughter of an affluent landowner. My dad is not a landowner, but this is the village where he lives, and he was at school with Brian. Engineering is less skewed towards entrants from affluent backgrounds than other professions. However, the expectation for physics and maths at A-level does mean that private school pupils are more likely to have the subjects required to study engineering at university. And like me, Alice started her journey into engineering with an interest in the RAF. Since graduating, Alice has found it difficult to establish her career, considering a job overseas and feeling undervalued at work. And that isn't helped if friends and families are perplexed by the idea of even being a female engineer. So it is good to hear Alice talking more about her work and the robotic systems that she is developing.
Right, so fingers crossed.
Where else are female engineers presented as a normal part of life? I could not find many, but we do find STEM women increasingly on TV, for example as forensic scientists in detective dramas, and even in chick lit. One of my favourites is Shopaholic's sister, a geologist called Jessica. Did you know that Sophie Kinsella herself has physics A-level? Children's fiction demonstrates more diversity, with characters such as Rosie Revere, engineer, introducing technical concepts as well as providing role models. Stereotypes are also challenged. In Zog, the princess intervenes between a dragon and a knight. She then persuades them to team up with her as a flying doctor. But there is a way to go yet. These Key Stage 2 study guides suggest that English is for everyone, but science is just for boys. 4 former presidents of the I-Struct-T suggested that there is more to a plough than a stem. Engineering needs creativity as well as science and maths, and improving diversity is one way of broadening that skills base. There has been a heated debate since, with one respondent suggesting that women just don't like getting muddy boots. He had obviously never met Peppa Pig. So if we are going to look beyond STEM for role models, who started me on my journey? Pippi Longstocking, Minnie the Minx, and Anne of Green Gables were all influences. But the first was a flower. My fellow Archers academics, may I present Elizabeth, growing in a research lab and bravely defending her position. I hope that she and Alice have sowed a seed with you also, because being a woman in engineering is not niche, it's normal.
We'll let Fiona know that you laughed and ooh at the correct places there, which has sincere apologies from her, but as you touch, got a very exciting family event to go. Fiona is on Twitter, isn't she?
She doesn't really follow, but she's on there.
Yeah. So you'll be able to find on Twitter if there's any direct questions that you have for her there. I'm wondering though whether Alice is somebody who's less a woman in engineering as more a woman down the pub or the off-licence. Maybe. Anyway, we will move on. Oh, sorry, yes?
You take any questions for that or comments on that?
We don't.
Well, it's without Fiona here. It's.
Can I make a comment though?
Yeah, comment.
Just in that it was brought up that she was challenged, why aren't you having babies over the other week?
Yes.
So she gets challenged.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it links with the previous one.
Yeah. Continuing our theme.
Yeah, it's like this has all been planned, isn't it? Thank you very much. Okay, well, it is perfectly planned because we follow on beautifully from this. So, we're from the University of Hertfordshire and we work with primary school teachers to provide professional development in science, which is a core subject in the primary curriculum. So whoever wrote that guide doesn't know what they're on about. It's for everybody in the primary curriculum. So for those of us who work in science education, a key driver for many years has been concern about the proportionately low number of girls as Fiona just said, choosing to study science post-16 and then to enter careers in STEM, so science, technology, engineering and maths. And there's been a lot of research to find out why that might be, and a huge amount of investment to get more girls into STEM. But you know, as listeners of The Archers, actually we note that young women are really happy to dive under tractor bonnets, up sheep birth canals, flaunt their plate meters, carry out experimental trials on herbal leys, mob grazing, and consult cheese-making academic texts, which are very thick. Now, Ambridge sisters roll up their sleeves and engage in scientific activity and careers with an enthusiasm not represented in the general population of the UK. So we decided to investigate this Ambridge STEM bubble using recent research from King's College as our lens. So, 76, Jim Callaghan, in a really influential speech at Ruskin College, Oxford, asked, why is it that such a high proportion of girls abandon science before leaving school? And the data from 1976 graduates in engineering, which is the year I was making my O-level choices, clearly shows why I don't have a science qualification. Because there just weren't the role models around. Girls weren't doing it. Now, a study of the BBC archives, Archer's archives at the time, reveals that Ambridge was right to be concerned. It appears that Callaghan was right to be concerned. It appears that there were no female characters in STEM employment at that time, apart from those defined as farmers' wives. The other women earned their living as shop assistants, barmaids, and hotel receptionists. Even Pat Archer, prior to her consciousness raising in the early 80s, really fitted that stereotypical farmer's wife mould. Now, since 76, a shed load of money has been thrown at this issue by successive governments and industry. It would be nice to think this has been done in the cause of equality. There are multiple reasons why girls should be encouraged to think that science is for them, political, social and individual reasons. But the reason that over £100 million has been invested in the last 10 years alone in interventions to address address the issue of insufficient numbers of STEM professionals in the workforce is really to do with economics, not equity and social justice. There are simply not enough young people altogether choosing to study STEM after the age of 16 to meet the future demands of our economy. As Whiteleg says it, the future supply issue would be really solved if girls just chose physics in similar numbers to boys. So to find out if those millions of pounds have had an impact in Ambridge, we use the STEM classifiers from the Department of Business, Education and Industry and the Higher Education Statistics Agency to code the occupations of the Ambridge employed. In Ambridge, there are currently 4 female farmers working at managerial level, a female engineer and 6 women working in food production. If the definition of is extended to thinking science is for them, Kirsty Miller, with her environmental activism, should be included in this list of STEMinists. To allow a valid comparison with UK statistics for the female proportion of the STEM workforce, medical careers can't be included, so we happily omitted Kate's holistic stuff. And we can't include Amy Frank's midwifery and Anisha's veterinary practice, but they've moved, so. So how does Ambridge compare to the rest of the nation? Well, it's doing better. Nationally, a difference has been made, but despite an 18% increase in the number of women doing science and maths A-level, or girls doing maths and science A-level in the last 7 years, girls and women are still underrepresented in most STEM subjects at every stage of the STEM pipeline, with a consequent impact on employment. So the nation actually is behind the Ambridge curve. Bravo, women of Ambridge. So what's been going on in Ambridge to buck the national trend? There's always been farmers' wives, daughters and female neighbours in Ambridge. So what's happened to change the employment choices of the current generation? Is it the impact of 40 years of intervention and investment into women in STEM? Is it a simple reflection of the increasing proportion of women in the workforce altogether? Or are there other sociological reasons? For Emma, Clary and Susan, the decision to work in the chicken factory or dairy is clearly driven by limited opportunities and economic need. But what has persuaded those women with higher social, cultural and economic capital to pursue careers in science when research tells us that the problem of gender stereotyping in STEM careers is really persistent? Are the young women of Ambridge simply better at science than their male siblings? Look at the picture, daughter. You've got a BSc. You've got a BSc. They certainly have higher science qualifications, but their academic endeavour is often shown as a necessity to compensate for their lack of inherited talent compared to their brothers. Oh, you know, how many times do we hear of Johnny Phillips' affinity for stock and Josh's intuitive understanding of machinery? They don't need no university education to achieve in STEM. That's the girls have to do that. They have to work hard, those diligent girls. Other representations of STEM success in Ambridge don't seem to conform to that gender stereotyping that underpin constructions of science careers as clever or brainy, not nurturing, geeky. And they sit in opposition to girls' self-identification as normal or caring or girly and active. Both men and women in Ambridge experiment with cropping plans, breeding regimes, new technologies, and production ideas, systematically collecting data, analysing and communicating their findings. Even Tom eventually got around to completing his Nuffield report, and look where that got him. Now, the scientific method is alive and well in Ambridge, as recently demonstrated by Helen installing new cheese-making machinery. There's loads of examples. They talk about research. Gender does not appear to affect agency or identity in terms of the residents' enthusiasm to engage in science inquiry. Even Susan Carter, we don't know whether she's got an O-level in chemistry, but her approach to applying for the CAFEA manager job was entirely scientific. Her lack of qualifications didn't appear to hold her back. Yeah, click you on.
Okay, so thank you, Jane. A useful tool.
Sorry, that was my Susan slide.
Oh, was your Susan slide?
That's how you make fear.
A useful tool to help analyse why a high proportion of women in Ambridge see science as for them could be Science Capital, which was developed by the Enterprising Science team, a 5-year project between King's College London and the Science Museum and funded by BP, which drew on the work of sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Now, the concept of Science Capital can be imagined as like a personal hold-all that contains all the science-related knowledge, attitudes, experience and resources that an individual has. This includes what science you know, which might include any science qualifications, how you think about science, your attitudes and dispositions. For example, considering the possibility of distilling gin from a cheese byproduct, or Alice's confident approach to new technologies. Third is what you do, your everyday engagement with science. For example, putting a lamb in your Aga. Or evaluating the implications of an anaerobic digester. And last but not least, who you know. What family and friends you have with interest or careers in science. And there's plenty of those in Ambridge. Now, from the research, we know that only 5% of the population have high science capital, and those are the ones that are most likely to aspire to STEM careers and further study of STEM. And most of them are male. Now, the Enterprising Science team used a complex combination of data to measure science capital. Our approach was somewhat more simple and just relied on the 4 key questions that you saw on the previous slide. But we have taken a sample of 5 Ambridge residents and included them on a table here. There is a complete table in a very good recent publication which is available downstairs, just giving it a little plug there. But as you can see, it's the female residents of Ambridge that are topping that table. So, what conclusion did... Oh, I'll leave you a moment to have a look at that. Okay, so what conclusions did our analysis lead us to? We felt that science capital overall in Ambridge is very high because of the agricultural science which just pervades so many of the villagers' activities. In contrast to the rest of the nation, the young women of Ambridge appear to have higher science capital than their male counterparts. But the young women of Ambridge appear to have to gain academic qualifications while their brothers and other halves have an innate ability with livestock, crops and machinery. The residents of Ambridge are happy to read and accurately follow instructions for diluting chemical sprays, drilling linseed and experimenting with hydroponics. And Ambridge is a shining example of a community fostering the science capital of its residents, one which the rest of the UK might learn from. So those high levels of STEM capital are clearly having an impact on STEM career choices, especially for the young women of Ambridge, which we hope will in turn influence the next generation. But we asked the question, could residents do more to increase science capital in the village? So, Justin, how about developing a new science park so that those with a wider range of STEM careers take up residence and widen the scientific career opportunities for the residents of Ambridge? Alice, could you become a STEM ambassador and visit local schools to inspire the next generation of STEM workers? Fallon, how about regular Café Scientifique events in the tea room? And finally, where are those academic male role models to inspire Jake, Henry and Jack that academic study of STEM subjects is a positive choice? References? Thank you.
Any questions? Yes, over there. Oh, there's quite a few.
Oh dear.
Hello. You're talking there about the women having higher STEM capital, which is great. I work in IT and I'm very used to being the only woman in the room. And it's depressed me a bit about how much I match a lot of STEM stereotypes. I'm far more academically qualified than most of my male colleagues. And do you think it's partly that factor that women do need to show their qualifications because they aren't seen as having the innate abilities in the same way? And also, it's not quite the same in farming, particularly when you're part of the family, but often women are promoted for their achievements, whereas where men are promoted for their potential.
No.
Okay. Well, the research certainly suggests that. That's what the research into science capital definitely backs up that women have to work harder at it and have to prove themselves in a more formal way. That you're confronting that gender stereotype all the time, that this is more natural for boys to do and succeed at. I mean, it is, and it's interesting. I mean, the big shift in Ambridge came with Ruth, because she was the person who arrived, and there's a really great line from Julie Birchall? Yeah, I think, saying, you know, it all changed when Ruth arrived, and instead of having a hand in an elven glove in the Argus, she had a hand up a cow. And that really did shift it, and you can really see that all of the, you know, that suddenly opened the door to females really engaging in a very different way to the farming life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, don't you remember Carol Gray coming in the 1950s? On her own small
sorry, born in 62. I just hadn't started in 50. In the 50s.
Tell us about Carol Gray.
Go on, can you tell us? Tell us all about her.
Oh, Carol Gray, who became Carol Tregoran.
Oh, did she? Oh, right. Oh, it's exciting. Give us more.
Some of us are old enough to remember her as Carol Gray. And she came into the village, and it must have been the 1950s, and ran her own small holding.
See.
At the time, she was perceived, oh my gosh, it's a woman running her own business and running her own small holding. But she then went on to be a very successful businesswoman.
And I mean, because when we put the chapter together, Cara wrote to me and said, there must have been some women working in science, and there really weren't. We went in 76, going through the archives. There were successful businesswomen. That was a model that was accepted, but I didn't know. That's my ignorance, I'm sorry.
Just on a general point, though, you've compared the statistics of students in Ambridge or qualifications with Ambridge and the rest of the country. Can you not compare it with the rest of rural England? Because I suspect it isn't peculiar when it's compared with rural areas.
We tried very hard and we really couldn't find that data. I mean, it just doesn't exist. And I live in a rural village, and actually, our village, we have about 4 farms around the village, and Ambridge is not representative of our village. So I honestly don't know, and we couldn't find that data. We did look quite hard.
I get on experience, because if you look at attendance at agricultural college, they call themselves universities now, but it is, I would suspect, 50-50 across the genders.
Yeah.
And there is a lot more female employment.
Good.
In land-based industries.
And of course, Carol Gray Tregoran gave her a good basis for her later interest in growing marijuana.
Yes, of course. Yes, thank you.
Question at the back, and that will have to be the last one for this paper.
We'll see.
Okay, I was just talking about Ruth and Pip, who seem to be missing from your charter people. Ruth, of course, with the college education.
We went for the under 40s.
Yeah. Also does the research, also does a lot of exploring new possibilities, reading up about future developments. Pip is the opposite, because she dropped out. She rejected the academic approach, but she still applies that method. She still looks at what's new, reads the papers on it, discusses it, and then wants to experiment. So maybe they should be added to your table as well.
Well, yeah, if you buy the book, you will find, many more residents of Ambridge, the younger population of Ambridge included in that table, and more than happy to talk to you over lunch about, how we worked out our STEM capital.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, you may have heard a little bit about this paper this week in... Yeah, well, I'm not going to say the name of it anyway. Should we just start? Thank you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
My name is Sarah Kate Merry, and the quote in my title comes from Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, in which she laments the lack of female friendships depicted in fiction. And the quote goes on to say, "All the great women of fiction were seen only in relation to the other sex, and how small a part of a woman's life is that." So her work, among other things, was part of the inspiration for what has come to be known as the Bechdel-Wallace test, originally the Bechdel test. And I'm going to talk today about my analysis of a year of Ambridge women's conversations using the Bechdel-Wallace test as the basis of the analysis. And I would like to start by saying I have never said that The Archers is sexist. Or I never compared it to a Bond film either. So I'm going to briefly talk about the Bechdel-Wallace test. I realise you won't be able to read this. I'll blow it up in a second. But for any of you who don't know the details, Alison Bechdel is a cartoonist and a graphic novelist, and she wrote an incredibly long-running webcomic series called Dykes to Watch Out For. And in one strip, this strip, entitled The Rule, the character explains that she only sees a film if it meets certain requirements. And these are the requirements. She sees a film if it has at least 2 women in it who have a conversation with each other, and it is about something that isn't a man. This strip was written in 1985. It sort of disappeared because things weren't reposted as much then, until in about 2005, when somebody picked it up. It suddenly started appearing all over the place, and people started talking about it as a way of they talked about it as the Bechdel test and using it as a way of evaluating the representation of women in film and in other media. So it's often used as a measure of how feminist or how sexist a piece of media is. I have lots of opinions about that. I don't really think that it works for it, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about it later on. I use Bechdel-Wallace test, as I said there. Liz Wallace, who is credited in the comic, her name is up on the film marquee, she came up with the idea, and Alison Bechdel used it, so she has asked people, if possible, to use the Bechdel-Wallace test. She prefers the double-barreled version. So, I took the test and adapted it very slightly for the archers. So I've used it very much as a base. And the basic criteria for a conversation to pass is that it must involve 2 or more women talking about something other than a man. And I gave it a time criterion as well, so anything more than 30 seconds, which seems like a lot out of a 13-minute episode, but actually, when I looked at the data, the vast majority of the conversations that didn't pass the 30-second rule actually didn't pass on other things. So they were mostly about men or a man joined the conversation. And my 4th criterion here is a man cannot be present even if silent. Obviously, if they're silent, I didn't know they were there. But I can't tell you how many times I was happily noting down the content of a women's conversation and all of a sudden somebody piped up from the corner of the room. They are very sneaky. So I kept those out. Also, if a man interrupted the conversation, so joined in, then I didn't count that. So when I was testing the archers, I had 3 different categories. When I did the chapter for the book, which was based on 5 months of data from February to June, I only looked at whole scenes. So I didn't really evaluate things that weren't an entire scene that was populated only by conversations that passed. But for this, I've looked at individual conversations because I thought it was quite an interesting thing. And I wanted to be a little bit less strict for this paper. So a conversation passes if it meets the criteria I already mentioned. A scene passes if it only contains conversations that are between women and that pass the criteria as far as time and topic are concerned. According to my criteria, a scene could have a number of different conversations. So as people move in and out. So one example of that is that, for example, Susan and Clary could be having a conversation and Pat comes in and joins in, and then maybe Tom enters the scene and makes it all about him. So that's a scene that could have 1 or 2 conversations between women, depending on time and topic, but the scene wouldn't pass because Tom comes in. And as far as episodes are concerned, I passed an episode if at least 1 scene within it passed my test. This is going to be quite numbery, so if you find numbers traumatic, brace yourself. And here's my first incredibly complicated chart. I will explain. So I looked at a whole year. So I looked from the start of March 2018 to the end of February 2019, the 313 episodes. In these episodes, there were 530 conversations between women. And out of these, 267 passed the test. So I think that's pretty good, actually, considering all the stuff that's been going on in the last year and how focused a lot of the storylines have been on men, so Freddie, Ross, Brian. There's been Shula and Alistair's divorce as well. A lot of stuff going on that involved men. So I think just a smidgen over 50% isn't bad at all. And now we're looking at the scenes. The picture is a bit less rosy. 507 scenes over the year where women talked to each other. 196 of them passed. So just under 40% of scenes only contained conversations that passed the test. This is what I looked at in my chapter. So I looked only at scenes in my chapter. And for those 5 months, it was a slightly lower percentage. This is a slightly lower percentage. So it might seem overly picky to expect a whole scene to pass the test, but the data does show that it is far more common for a man to come in and interrupt women's conversations than vice versa. This is how the episodes panned out. Of the 313 episodes, 109 of them passed the test. So that's 35%. So at least those 109 had at least one scene made up of women's conversations that met the criteria. Of the 204 episodes that didn't, 96 had scenes that failed because the conversations between women were about men, or they were shorter than 30 seconds, which means that 35% of all of the episodes during that year did not contain any conversations between women at all. When I did the analysis for the book chapter, it was more or less the same kind of percentage, and I found that the most surprising result out of everything. And I was hoping it would have changed slightly when we were looking at a whole year, but no, unfortunately not. This is going to be my last graph, but I wanted to talk quickly about the amount of time that women's conversations take up. When I looked at these are the qualifying conversations, and out of the episodes that had qualifying conversations in them, more than about 40% of the total time of the episode, that's the kind of average, that's the majority of the time taken. So for for the vast majority, women's conversations took up less than 40% of the time, even if the episode passed. So it's quite a small amount, really. So I want to talk about the voices that we heard most often during the year. So I'm talking about not just the conversations that passed, but also the conversations that didn't pass. So how often we heard women's voices talking to each other. So does anyone want to take a guess at who we heard most often over that year? No, blimey, I thought everyone was no. Okay, they're all up there, but Elizabeth and Jenny were top of the table. Word cloud. So obviously, the larger the text is, the more often we heard the people, and this shows the conversations that passed. So in conversations that didn't pass, or the total number of conversations between women, Elizabeth was way up there. She had about 135 conversations over the whole year with her and another woman, but out of them, only 52 passed the test. So obviously Elizabeth had a lot to talk about, but most of it was to do with Freddie and Russ. Jennifer also had a lot to talk about, and again, she came just below Elizabeth in terms of the total number of conversations. Surprisingly, she came a lot higher than her in terms of conversations that passed. And I think, although she did spend a lot of time not talking to Brian, so I suppose that and being very angry with Brian. So a lot of her conversations were with Lillian and Peggy. Close, sort of high up again, you mentioned Lillian, and there's Pat is up there. Lily, obviously, she had a lot of conversations with Elizabeth. Pat and Helen, a lot of conversations. And Olwyn is up there. Because although she was only around for a couple of months, she talked a lot and all of her conversations passed. And most of her conversations were with Pat, so so she bumped Pat's stats up a bit as well. If anyone has really good eyesight, you might spot that underneath Olwyn's name on the bottom left is Bess. If anyone doesn't remember who Bess is, it's Ben's sheepdog. I have to admit, I totally did this to entertain myself, but it's true. There was a 30-second conversation between Jill and Bess in the Brookville kitchen on the day that Jill poisoned her. So having looked at the individuals, these are the people who talked most often to each other. There are a lot of conversations between 3 and 4 women as well, but these are the top counts were all between pairs. So these are ordered by the conversations that pass. But you can see that there's quite high numbers of conversations. But the percentages of of conversations against passing conversations are quite interesting, especially when you look at Elizabeth and Shula, who had 30 conversations, which is quite a high number, but only 7 of them passed because they were, almost all about Russ, Freddie, or Alistair. Elizabeth and Lily, high up there. They did talk a lot about Freddie, obviously, but they also talked a lot about Lower Loxley and about Meredith. So, Meredith and lesbianism are high up there on the topics of conversation. Helen and Pat, of course, because no one else seems to want to talk to them. So out of the 10, these are the top 10, obviously. Out of the top 10, 6 of them are related, 6 pairs. And I actually thought that was quite a, low percentage for Ambridge. The Olwen and Pat sort of dyad was an intense flurry of conversations while Olwen was there. So she came in late March, early April, and she was gone by June. But as I said, nearly all of her conversations passed. Again, Geraldine, I don't think I heard Geraldine until Elizabeth started to spiral downwards. And a lot of their conversations were, of course, regarding Halloween and all of the hoo-ha that happened around then. Lily and Elinda, utter joy. Every time they spoke to each other, I was so happy. It was mostly about dogs, to be fair. They have their ongoing love-hate relationship, obviously, but the dogs were, they brought out something extra in their relationship, I think. And of course, we have Clary and Susan's true relationship, which I think Lamagate properly underlined for us all. As far as conversations where every conversation that a pair or more of women had, if they all passed, there weren't that many that had a reasonable number, over a year. The highest number was Olwen and Pat. Every single one of their conversations passed. And Christine and Peggy as well. But Christine and Peggy had 5 conversations, and all of those passed. So these are the topics. This is the last thing I want to talk about. So the main topic of conversations, these are the top 10, but I want to... Cheese! Obviously, Helen and Pat are high up there. There's Home Farm, obviously. I've kind of merged things in together. So Home Farm, the conversations were about the partnership, the meetings, and about the sale of the land initially, and then of the house. So obviously that was the only thing Jennifer talked about, really. Christine was a big topic of conversation. She kind of wasn't around much for the first 6 months or so, but then she had her fall, and then she was in hospital, and no one knew where she was going for Christmas, and there was all this stuff. And I think it shows quite clearly how well-regarded, well, I'd like to think it shows how clearly how well-regarded Christine is within the community, or it might mean that she'll be dead by summer. Who knows? And of course, affordable housing, up until the point when Emma wasn't allowed to talk about it anymore. That was high up the list, and Canterbury Tales. So I made another word cloud, because who can resist a word cloud? I don't know how visible that is from the back, but these are the top 25 or so. Lamagate is up there because, it was a big topic of conversation for Linda for a while. You can see that cheese is high. The Pond of Poison, people did manage to talk about it without talking about Brian, which is quite impressive. And dogs, obviously, very high up. They come short just after cheese, I think, because obviously Linda searched for the dog with the perfect rear view, using what Olwen called Tinder for dogs. So that's it. That was a very whistle-stop tour through the results of my data analysis and my investigation into the conversations of the women of Ambridge. It was, I think it was an exploration rather than a desire to answer a question, but I think while it doesn't prove that the Archers is sexist, it does show that we don't hear enough of the women of Ambridge, although your opinion on that might differ depending on which women we're hearing. So, thank you very much.
Any questions?
No, what's this question?
You had 108 episodes that no women were talking.
Yep. No women talking to each other.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How many episodes where no men talk to each other?
I cannot, well, I would say none, because I don't have any episodes that are 100% women, apart from the Elizabeth therapy session. But I didn't count whether an episode was entirely made of men. So any episode where women didn't talk, I didn't really pay any attention to the other conversations. So I feel like that's something I want to go on to next. So I can't tell you the answer. I feel like my sense is that there are more conversations between women and men than between just, I think there are probably more episodes where there are conversations between women and men, but women don't talk to each other. I feel like there's probably not episodes which are entirely men talking, but I don't have the data to back it up.
Hi.
Hi.
Your figures really help me understand one of the reasons I've been a bit dissatisfied with some of my listening, which is that there's less female friendship going on in the Archers. And I think back to when Shula and Carolynne were great friends.
Yep.
And I think about how Usha helped Ruth after her breast cancer, and Kirsty with Helen.
Yep.
And also Carol's disappeared out of Jill's life. She's got new male interest, but Carol seems to have disappeared.
I can't be absolutely certain off the top of my head. I think Carol had 2 conversations with Jill over the whole year.
Yeah.
Might be slightly
now
wrong.
hear they speak on the telephone, which seems a bit odd when they're both in the village.
Yeah.
And this is my first time at this sort of event, and my wonderings are, how does this influence the script writers, if at all? Do they come incognito, or because for me as a listener, the lack of female friendship has really detracted from my enjoyment of the arts. I would like that to be fed back to them through that camera, maybe.
Kathy, that's
a massive gap.
She's a real loss, actually, with all the stuff that happened. She just wasn't there. So yeah, Kathy's silence has taken a significant friendship out of Ambridge.
Last question, and then we have to move on.
One of the really interesting female conversations in the last few months was the Emma and Mia about menstruation.
Yes.
And that felt different from anything we ever heard before, or I'd heard before. And I wondered just what your response was to that.
I agree. It was outside my analysis period, unfortunately. But yeah, I did think that. I thought that it was definitely, it had a different feel to it. And I don't know why. I don't know whether there's a new scriptwriter, or what. I don't know. I don't have an answer. But yes, I agree with you. I think that was noticeably different. Okay, thank you.
That was a mammoth piece of research you undertook there, and it's just great to see such rich data. Thank you very much. Moving swiftly on. Carolynne.
Hello, let's see if I can get this thing. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Great. I'm so excited to be here. I've been trying to get up here for 4 years, and finally I've made it. So thank you for having me. In my talk, I'm going to be talking about unplanned pregnancy decisions. So, of course, many of the people in this room will have their own fertility stories. And I don't know if my talk will bring anything up for anybody here. I hope that it won't. But I just want to make it clear before I start that if it does bring up any difficult or emotive stuff, it's perfectly fine to leave the room. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the question. When Pip got unexpectedly pregnant after a few tumbles with Toby at Lower Loxley, it got me thinking. How do the decisions by Ambridge women compare to the rest of the UK? Do they reflect the decisions made by other women in the UK? Or do Ambridge women make different choices? Is it fair even to extrapolate? I'm going to explore the choices made by 4 local women faced with a difficult decision, and I'll try to frame them, where possible, in the national context. So, what is the national context? In the UK, 1 in 3 women will experience abortion in their lifetime. Around 1 in 6 pregnancies in the UK is unplanned, and a further third are considered ambivalent, leaving only 55% of pregnancies as fully intended events. According to The Lancet, only around 6% of unplanned pregnancies go to term, with more than half ending in abortion and another third in miscarriage. For those pregnancies classed as ambivalent, only a third make it to full term. Okay, let's frame that against the Ambridge experience. Since the Archers began, there have been approximately a dozen storylines relating to unplanned or unwanted pregnancy, from Jennifer Archer with Adam in 1966 through to the birth of soon-to-be christened Rosie in 2018. 2 of these storylines have ended in abortion and 2 in miscarriages. Now, unexpected pregnancy yields different reactions in the Archers, just as it does in real life. Susan's pregnancy with Emma expedited a marriage proposal from Neil. Kate infamously decided not to take mum Jennifer's advice about having an abortion and instead gave birth to Phoebe in a tent in Glastonbury. Tom and Kirsty's night of passion in 2017 ultimately ended in a miscarriage, turning their worlds upside down for a second time after he spectacularly ditched her at the altar in 2014. Now, I've chosen to focus on 4 of the pregnancy stories. Helen Archer, Kate Aldridge, Vicky Tucker, and Elizabeth Partridger. No, that's a lie. I'm lying. I'm not focusing on Kate. Who wants to focus on Kate? I'm talking about Pip. It's like, hang on a minute, I'm not talking about her. Right. Helen. Now, Helen became pregnant as a result of marital rape by her then husband and serial abuser, Rob Titchener. You will be relieved to know that I won't be going over that harrowing storyline in any detail, but instead want to focus solely on her decision to keep baby Jack. Is that in keeping with reality? It's all but impossible to get exact statistics on the number of pregnancies carried to term that have resulted from marital rape due to the nature of this violence. There have been a number of studies carried out on users of healthcare and refuge services, however. We know from women's testimony that pregnancy coercion exists. And there's good evidence that there is a link between intimate partner violence and unintended pregnancy, and that risk doubles among those women reporting both partner violence and reproductive coercion. Thus, I believe it can be considered realistic that Helen's decision to have Jack was in line with an expected outcome for a woman in her position. Number 2, Pip, the one that got me thinking about this all to begin with. Now, she got pregnant at the age of 24 after a condom failed. What do the statistical norms tell us of Pip's situation and her course of action afterwards? Now, with typical use, condoms are about 82% effective. So 18 women out of 100 will get pregnant in a year. So to become pregnant whilst using condoms is a fairly commonplace occurrence. Top tip for the future Pip, implants and coils are much more effective. 1 in 6 pregnancies in the UK is unplanned. And there's been a long-term rise in the percentage of conceptions occurring outside marriage or civil partnership, reaching almost 60% in 2016. According to the ONS, around a third of Pip's peers, aged 20 to 24, chose to terminate their pregnancies. So, in the light of that, her decision to have Rosie seems to be roughly in line with her age cohort. Vicky. I miss her. Do you miss her? Come back, Vicky. Now, she was found herself shocked to be pregnant in her late 40s, and she subsequently discovered the child would have Down syndrome. Husband Mike was heading towards retirement in his 60s, and he voiced concerns that they would struggle to cope with a child with additional and unknown needs. Vicky, on the other hand, if you remember, was always determined to keep the pregnancy. She felt this was her first and possibly only time to become a mother. Now, apart from a notorious and crude poll that the BBC asked listeners to vote on Vicky's decision, the storyline was broadly handled with sensitivity by the BBC, accurately, I believe, reflecting the soul-searching that forms part of the decision-making process. When trying to determine whether Vicky and Mike's choices reflect the national average, we're fortunate to have extremely accurate statistics for pregnancies where Down syndrome is diagnosed. There is also reliable data on the number of terminations related to these pregnancies in the National Down Syndrome Cytogenic Register. The register shows that Vicky and Mike's decision to keep Bethany was mirrored by just 9% of their peers. Parents have said that it's a particularly agonising decision to make because the condition can present so widely, such a wide range of symptoms, and it's impossible to know prenatally exactly what needs the child will have. So it's a very difficult choice to make. Bethany's needs seem to be at the lower end of the spectrum, and the joy that she's brought to Mike and Vicky's lives is evident. I'm just sad that we don't get to see more of her story. Last but not least, Lizzie. Now, like Pip, she was 24 when she fell pregnant, and she chose to have an abortion after conman Cameron Fraser abandoned her. I know, what a snake. He a bad man. He abandoned her in a car park off the M40. What a gentleman. Now, her story is of a naive young woman dating a mendacious and unreliable older man. Around 7 months into the relationship, she fell pregnant. Debbie took her to a local pharmacy to confirm. Now, Cameron, far from being delighted to find out he's become a father, coolly offered to pay for an abortion. And initially, Elizabeth was unable to countenance this course of action. After the abandonment in said car park, a devastated Elizabeth returned to the village. And Shula offered to adopt the child. Now, you may remember Shula and Mark were struggling to conceive at the time. Despite Shula's offer and her mother's protests, Elizabeth disappeared and had an abortion in a clinic in Felpersham. When she returned to Ambridge, she told her shocked parents that after much soul-searching, she just couldn't have the baby. Now, under the current legal framework in the UK, Elizabeth's abortion would likely have been carried out under Ground C, where continuing the pregnancy would pose a greater risk to her mental health than having the termination. 97% of terminations in the UK are undertaken under Ground C, and the majority of those are under the mental health ground rather than the physical health ground, about 99.8%, I think. No additional information is collected from these women. There's no requirement under law. So we only have anecdotal information as to the widely varied circumstances which lead people to seek an abortion. Now, Elizabeth's story is certainly dramatic, but I would argue is by no means any more shocking than many of the real-life stories that doctors witness daily throughout their careers. So, in conclusion, do the women of Ambridge behave normally when faced with an unexpected pregnancy? With such a small catchment area and limited demographic information, it's pretty hard to extrapolate, actually. There's only been 2 known abortions in Ambridge since legalisation in 1967. So on the face of it, that does seem an unusually low number. Looking at the national statistics, it seems likely that over the years, several Ambridge women have gone to Felpersham shopping or up to London to visit a friend. Abortion stigma still exists, and the majority of people tend to keep their decisions under wraps to this day. They might only just tell a few close family members, perhaps the father. Thus, it may be that the scriptwriters are telling us only the stories that are more widely known in the village, and that Sabrina Thwaite, Carol Tregoran, Linda Snell, and perhaps even the Button Girls all have stories to tell that have eluded both Susan's hungry ears and our own. Thank you.
About all of that.
No.
decriminalised in 1967 just then.
Oh.
I've just checked on my favourite website, legislation.gov.uk.
It's not legal, it's partially decriminalised.
Yeah, so they are actually just introducing an exception to the offence of procuring an abortion. I assume that's what the offence is. Do you think that that contributes to the stigma around abortion in any way? And do you think that the stigma could be addressed by some form of representation on the archers, maybe?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. Thank you for correcting my false legal representation. It is partially decriminalised, you're right, it's a retraction of a previous piece of legislation. I think the piece of the part of the legislation where women have to get the permission of 2 doctors to take control of a healthcare choice, which is completely out of line with any other healthcare decisions that we make. If we think about cancer or any other medical condition, you don't need sign-off or permission from 2 doctors to make that decision. So I think that contributes massively to the stigma and the way that these things are handled. Yeah.
I've got a couple. There is another thing which is comparable to that, which is trying to get sterilised.
Yes, no, of course. And gender reassignment, so I take it back.
Anyone who wants to hear stories about what you have to do if you're a woman and you want to get sterilised, certainly locally to me in Brighton, permission of my husband, yes, because I'm not my own person. I could go on about that.
Yes.
But what I was wondering was, I still find it quite frustrating that a lot of, not just the Archers, but in other dramas, sort of pregnancy, is someone going to have a baby or not, is quite a well-worn trope, and it seems to be quite an easy way to advance storylines, so I wondered what you thought about that.
Yes, I mean, looking at that, you know, we've had a dozen over the whole course of the Archers. It feeds back into those gender expectations that we were talking about earlier. It's a rural situation. It is expected, and we talk about Alice. She doesn't want to have a kid. She wants to stay in her STEM career, and it keeps coming up. Those expectations. It's a well-worn path, and we don't get many exceptions. The thing I will say is, having done the study for these case studies, is the scriptwriters do a fairly good job of exploring the differences. So they do a reasonable job of exploring alternatives. It's just that the majority of times they don't go with the alternatives, so it's slightly out of sync, I would say, with the national experience on very limited data.
So I'm really struggling for time.
Oh,
yeah, sorry, just one more question. If you go there.
Yep.
Hello. I'd just like to point out that there's a difference between a miscarriage, a termination and abortion. I find it quite distressing that the whole 3 things got different emotional labels.
Yes. Yeah.
And certainly growing up in a farming family, I was offered a place by the dairy farmer that I could keep my donkey in his farm because that would prevent abortions in cattle.
Oh gosh. Yeah, interesting.
But they are very separate.
Very separate. Yes.
They have very different emotional
absolutely.
connotations with them.
We don't have time to talk about that, but some of the treatment of women in hospital.
With your commentary, you switch between abortion and miscarriage or termination. And not miscarriage, but abortion and termination. And I think they're very separate things.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah. No, but you're right. Treatment of women in hospital. There's lots of evidence of women going on to gynae wards with miscarriages, and it being very, very difficult. So yeah, absolutely. Still today, that women can struggle with that. Thank you.
Last question.
I noticed you didn't mention Phoebe, and she took the money after go.
Yes. Well, I thought about it. It was because it was unplanned pregnancy and she didn't get that far. So I excluded her because she took... Yeah.
Show that there were alternatives out there.
Yeah, no, I just excluded her because she did take the morning after pill, which is seen as a form of contraception. So she didn't fall into my storyline. But thank you. Yeah, no, she's definitely up there. Thank you.
So, on to a character who's definitely the woman of the week for me. Hannah, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for having me. Can you hear me? Yes. So this is my lot. I'm keeping you for lunch. I'm going to defend Shula, and I'm going to talk philosophy. Bear with me. So the title is, this isn't about Corey Alistair, Shula Hepton Lloyd and Iris Murdoch on love.
And when this went through the very cruel peer review system, I got 19 reviews, most of it positive, fortunately, and number 13 was very accurate. It said, feels really organic from a scholar immersed in the work with the radio on. And this was what happened. I was working on Iris Murdoch, writing on the most recent of her publications, and then I heard Shula sort of say, I don't love you anymore, while I noticed how much was written on love in Iris Murdoch. So that's what brought this together. So what was the situation? 14th of March, 2018, a year ago, Shula realizes her marriage is over. And she says to Alistair, it's just how I feel, I just don't love you anymore. And what was interesting is that she keeps repeating that. I don't love you anymore. I don't love him anymore. And at the top of her voice, when her son comes home, right? It's all rather cruel, but she can't explain it. She can't say why that is a sufficient reason. So this is where Iris Murdoch comes to the rescue. And I have to say as well that I thought Shula needed a defense, right? A woman should be believed at her work from time to time. And I know how controversial that is. So, first of all, Iris Murdoch, I don't know, she was a great Archers fan, and I assume some Archer fans know of her work. Is that right? Is anyone? Yeah. So she born 1919, so this is her centennial. There's all sorts of activities going on. So she was a great listener to the Archers. She was also a great novelist, wrote 26 novels between 1954 and 1995. And she was, what is less known, a philosopher. She was the first to introduce Sartre to the English-speaking world. She wrote on Plato, and I've brought some props just in case the technology wouldn't work. Sovereignty of Good, 1970, is still a classic in philosophy. And 1992, she publishes The Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, which was actually the first book I read by her, which is a rather unusual way to get into Iris Murdoch, which I think is still one of the most brilliant and understandable books of philosophy. And love is a central notion, especially in the sovereignty of good. So this is what she writes there. Should an unhappy marriage be continued for the children, the love which brings the right answer is an exercise of justice and realism and really looking. Now, what I hope to do is to sort of explain this quotation, but it's really, Iris Murdoch, looking is a really important aspect of her thinking when it comes to love, when it comes to moral philosophy in general. But to introduce her topic, I thought it might be useful to sort of relate the existing positions of other characters to philosophical positions. So, first of all, hedonism, Kenton. This is both Kenton and Elizabeth do this a bit. Shula says, I don't love you anymore. And Kenton says, if that's how you feel, then you should divorce Alistair, right? So feelings of pleasant and of pleasure and of pain are what makes the decision warranted for him. Determinism, again, this is Elizabeth and Kenton a bit. They both say, well, you know, if things just go to the end of the road, things run their course, those sorts of things. It just happens. And Alistair has nothing of it, right? He says, like a car crash where nobody is guilty. He doesn't like that. But the most interesting one, and here I'm going to defend another one, is Jill. And she has actually a really interesting way of arguing her case. So she mostly argues from principles. So this phrase, do your wedding vows mean nothing to you? It's hers. And then Shula says, well, you know, she first doesn't think it's a fair question. And secondly, she says, well, they did when I said them, which is really a cop-out, because if that's a promise, what is a promise? But there's a really interesting scene when Jill again reverts to principle when the two women reconcile. And I think that scene is both rather moving and rather comical at the same time. So Jill is talking to her daughter Elizabeth. This is when Elizabeth still believes in the existence of Meredith. And she says, well, this is what mothers do. Mothers, support their children. And Jill thinks, okay, aha, I've got it. Off she goes, finds Shula, who's bell ringing at the moment, and says, I support you. And Shula has no clue what she's talking about. I know you don't like that, da-da-da-da-da. And Jill says, no, let me explain. Mothers support their children, and that's what I'm doing now. So Shula still doesn't get it, and it's not until Jill says, can I have a hug, that they reconcile. And I thought that was a rather moving and well-written scene. So, hedonism, right? What pleasure or pain. Determinism, this is what's going to happen. Principle, this is which applied in life. But the most interesting response is, of course, Alistair. And Alistair is where Iris Murdoch comes in. So Alistair keeps emphasizing reason and argument. When the first time Shula tells him, I don't love him anymore, he says, we need to talk about this. He calls the situation insane, madness, stupid. And he keeps thinking that insight in the causes, insight might cause her to change her mind. And she's saying, no, that's not going to happen. And then when none of this happens, he reverses to magical thinking. So first, suddenly he starts saying that the whole world, the universe of women, especially Anisha Shula, is against him. And then he reverts to gambling. Now, that's slightly what Murdoch calls in The Sovereignty of Good, ideally rational man. She develops this sort of man, this image, in a discussion with one of her contemporaries, Stuart Hampshire's, but she says it's also lurking behind a lot of the things that we're doing. So perhaps it's lurking behind Ambridge as well. So what characterizes ideally rational man? He says we ought to know what we're doing. We should aim at total knowledge of our situation and a clear conceptualization of all our possibilities. So this is Alistair. He says, well, when there is a situation, we need to understand the situation in its extremes, and then once we have that, we take a decision and we act. And that's what he wants to do. He wants to have a full understanding of the situation. Now, Murdoch objects to this. She says, well, she has a number of objections to it, but one of them is that she thinks we shouldn't think of moral philosophy just in terms of action and choice. And the other is that she says people are not like that. When we make a decision, she quotes Sartre, the die is already cast. What she wants to do instead is bring in love as a central notion into philosophy. And she says love is this. It's the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. Love is the discovery of reality. So what does she mean by this? She means that love is often, she's here influenced by people like Simone Weil. She says that love is waiting. What we need to do in moral situations is often wait and look and see what the situation requires. She also, and this is one of her really big points, says where moral philosophy matters is often what we do in between decisions, what kind of thoughts we have, how our inner life develops. When it comes to the decision, often the decision has already been made. What moral philosophy should look at is that period in between decisions, where we're musing, where we're thinking, where we're attending to other things. And that's actually really difficult because, according to Iris Murdoch, we are all very selfish people. Now, and I think that the Archer family sort of illustrates very well. I mean, she also says love is ambiguous, and if you have ever read one of her novels, you know how ambiguous she can present that. But love can bring us out of ourselves. It can bring us awareness of the other. And she says falling in love is often a characteristic of that, right? Falling in love, this is a quotation from her later work, is for many people their most intense experience, bringing with it a quasi-religious certainty, and most disturbing because it shifts the center of the world from the outside, to the outside to the other place. So falling in love can sort of bring this moral pilgrimage, this moral change in people, Murdoch argues. So was that what happened to Shula? Now, as the story unfolds, we know that she had that crucial insight was gained, actually, by her feeling briefly attracted to the builder, Philip Moss, as she confesses at one point to her cousin, Lillian. So as the soul in Plato's Phaedrus, falling in love, even if only so briefly, because it was briefly, helped her see what is missing and remember the love and the joy she had once had. So she often talks about joy as well. She wants to get the joy back. So Shula may lack the moral vocabulary to express this insight in anything but selfish terms, but other characters may miss it as well by looking at it from different positions. Shula's love is likely to be a mixture of selfishness and selfishness. She may be attracted to the good, to some sort of standard, and that is happening at the cost of actual individuals. But none of this implies, I would say, that she did not retrieve a genuine memory of what is essential in her life. Love is ambiguous. It is often, but not always, selfish, but it's also central to our lives and it motivates us. As Murdoch puts it, we're spiritual creatures, attracted by excellent, made for the good. So the remembered attraction to the good explains why Shula refuses to compromise any longer and why she fears that if she stays with Alistair, her love may attach itself to something unworthy. She will start to hate Alistair, and all our love will be crushed out of her. Turning 60, as Shula does in the summer of 2080, is not for her a reason to give up on loving. On the contrary, there's no retirement age in moral pilgrimage. And I think it's very interesting that when Karen presented her, this is also her queer time, right? She doesn't give up on that. She is wonderful. So where does that leave us? Well, when I was doing this over the summer, I was writing this article and listening fanatically to the artists and hoping nothing would sort of ruin my argument. And then this week, so I just moved house. We are without internet and everything. And then I saw Thursday, Shula has her doubts, so I sort of freaked out. And I cancelled all my appointments to be at the radio at 7 o'clock. Anyway, so Shula's sermon, where is it coming? So I'm really pleased Shula is interested in art because this is a wonderful other Murdochian turn where art is really important for Murdoch. So in The Bell, for instance, she uses this painting in the National Gallery for one of her characters to change her mind and find out what she's doing. So that Shula said on Thursday, I don't have it literally, but something along the line, art can help you spiritually, transcendence. She was completely crushed. But I would say that is a really Murdochian idea, and I'm really, really excited to hear that. So what will happen on Sunday? I'm really glad I'm presenting now. I'm done. I have my hopes up that she will say something fantastic and she will explain and get this Murdoch in her, but I'm not holding my breath. Thank you.
That was absolutely joyous.
It really was. Absolutely love that.
Questions, anyone?
Well, your Shula haters out there, go for it.
Can we just have a quick show of hands? Who hates Shula and thinks she's irredeemable?
Oh, okay.
Not so many, actually.
They've come down in numbers. They've come down in numbers.
Yeah.
What about a show of hands as to whether she was just normal human fallible?
Normal human and fallible Shula. Ooh. Anything else? Anyone want to pick up on the Iris Murdoch? Oh, there we are.
I wanted to know whether you thought Shula's age, she mentioned that she was 60, had a factor, because I was reading in the paper a few months ago that the rise of divorce in this particular age demographic has gone much higher than it used to be. So is it reflecting something about social change happening in our country?
So that's not my expertise. I don't know at all. But what I thought was interesting is that she was not believed, right? So I thought this was a really good reason. And so over the summer, I showed my paper to a couple of my friends who are not Murdoch specialists to see if they could understand it. And I had really wonderful conversations, really moving conversations about divorce and why people divorce, and that some reasons are not considered good enough for divorce. So I also think, well, if she doesn't love him, that is a really good reason to divorce. And so I wanted to come to her defense. And even at 60, right, that is still an age in which a woman should be believed and should be allowed to do something with her life. No.
Not just legally, I mean legally there's only a few ways to get divorced and they have to be really...
I know, in this country it's
very strange. The burden of proof is incredibly high,
yeah,
very weird.
It's very strange.
It's not really a question, I just want to say thank you for doing that, because I've been in the minority in various culture groups listening to Shula's story, and I don't much like Shula, I'll be honest, but this storyline had me kind of fired up. I aligned myself with Shula, and I was much younger. But I made some of the decision coming from a religious sort of background family, and the battles that she went through justifying herself are similar to the ones that I went through. Trying to explain, I haven't read any of Iris Murdoch, I'm going to have to go and do that. Trying to explain my decision making, you have summed it up, was very, very difficult. Clearly, for most people here, it still doesn't resonate. But thank you. No objection. I want to go and meet you now. I can come find you later.
Yeah, I'll recommend some. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
One question in the back. I saw the breakup being triggered finally to Shula's realisation that the marriage was at an end when she sought Alistair's advice about whether she should own up about the Hunt Saboteur incident, where her beliefs were really challenged. She had two sets of loyalties that were really challenged, and she needed somebody to talk about that with as to what the right course of action was. He wasn't the least bit interested, he didn't want to know, he didn't care what she thought. And at that point, I thought, you know what, just get rid of him, because it's not a voice.
So maybe the end of moral philosophy
yes.
is the end of marriage.
that might well be. I mean, it was also very well introduced just the week before, where she had just gotten the inheritance from Caroline, and she says, let's do something, go somewhere. Yeah. And he says, it's just not my cup of tea. And then they make... That was her attempt, yes. Yeah. That was her last attempt. But I think you sort of see how dour and sour and everything he become, yeah. And not interested, yes.
Would people's reactions have been the same if it had been Alistair who had said, I want out, and not Shula?
That might not, yes. No, I don't think so. I think they would have been different, but yeah. Well, because, this is pure speculation. I mean, I don't know, but I do think it's a bit in the question, Michelle as well, right? That I think women are just not regarded in the same way as men, right? So Alistair, would he have been said, like, this is what you do by his father, like, you just stick in a marriage? In particular with her son. So her son comes and says, well, what would your life be like without being married? I mean, I just thought, 2018, I'm still hearing this, like, you can't be anything but married. I don't think the same applies to men, so I think the responses would have been different.
You don't think it applies?
I think the
different.
I mean, surely, there's an equality here. Either it's wrong or it's right.
What is wrong or what is right?
I mean, doing what Shula did.
Okay, but I'm not saying it's wrong or it's right.
I'm saying morally, there's only difference between a man doing it and a woman saying it.
I see, but I'm not in the business of saying it's wrong or it's right. I'm trying to say, how do we understand this when she doesn't give any reasons?
Right, lunch.
Shall we all go to lunch now?
An hour? Yeah. 1 hour.
1 hour. I forgot to do my thing of the Irish Murder postcard.